particular video is going to be looking at the biological explanation of OCD, and this video is only going to be focusing on the AO1, so the theories, the ideas, the knowledge part. The next video that you're going to be looking at will be focusing on the evaluation side. So the biological explanation for OCD can be divided in two, really. We've got the genetic explanation, which looks at the role of chromosomes, DNA, and passing information from one parent to their offspring. And then we've also got the neural explanation, and that looks at the functioning of the brain and our nervous system. And these two different explanations can provide us with different approaches on how OCD actually occurs. So the first we're going to look at is a study for the genetic explanation of OCD. And Lewis conducted a study way back in 1936 and found that in OCD patients, 37% of them had parents who had OCD. In addition, 21% of their siblings had OCD as well. And this was a lot higher than the general population. So it suggests that there must be a genetic link for OCD. But it's probably more likely that what's passed on is actual genetic vulnerability rather than certainty of OCD. So because the figures aren't 100%, it means that you're not certain to be passed on OCD through genetics. However, you might be passed on an increased risk of developing the disorder. So we call that the genetic vulnerability. That it's unlikely you're certainly going to have it, but it does increase your chances of developing OCD. Another genetic explanation for OCD looks at something called the COMT gene. And the COMT gene is linked in the production of dopamine. So high levels of dopamine have been shown to increase the severity of OCD symptoms. And when your dopamine levels get too high, the COMT gene regulates that and brings it back down to normal. So it's a really important gene inside our body, and especially when it's linked to OCD. And it's been suggested that people with OCD might have a variation of this particular gene. And what that means is when OCD levels start to get higher in people with OCD, the COMT gene doesn't kick in. It doesn't bring it back to normal. So dopamine levels continue to get higher and higher and higher. And this has been linked to an increase in the severity of OCD symptoms. And OCD patients have been shown in the past to have this variation, that their COMT gene is different to a healthy, normal person. And because this allows their dopamine levels to get higher and higher and higher, this has been a reason potentially for causing OCD. So some people have suggested that it's impossible to actually find a gene that causes OCD, and it's more likely that OCD is polygenic. So by polygenic we mean there are more than one gene involved in the actual process. If you look at OCD and what some studies have found, some have found that it's due to increases in dopamine or decreased levels of serotonin, brain functioning. There's an awful lot of things going on there, and what some people have suggested, like Taylor only a few years ago, was that you might have up to 230 different genes actually involved in OCD. So it's almost impossible to pinpoint one particular gene. We spoke about the COMT gene. That might be one of the 230 that are involved in someone who's actually got OCD. And you've also got different types of OCD. So we've got contamination OCD, we've got symmetry OCD. It's likely that these two different types also have their own genes that cause them. So the whole idea of genetics and one gene causing OCD is probably highly unlikely. So for the neural explanations, we're really looking at two things. We're looking at all those chemicals that are going on around your brain, all those neurotransmitters, and we're also looking at the brain function itself. So one of the main things and one of the main chemicals that have been linked to OCD is serotonin. And what they found is that serotonin is really important in two things in our body. It's important in our mood. It's our feel-good hormone. Some of you will have learned that last year if you did PE GCSE. And also, it prevents the repetition of tasks. So what they found is that if we have low levels of serotonin in our body, then our severity of OCD will start to increase. So because it's involved in preventing repetitive actions, as soon as we get low levels of it, our repetitive actions start to increase. So low levels of serotonin equals high levels of OCD. Another neurotransmitter that you need to know about is dopamine. So serotonin and dopamine, they're both neurotransmitters, and what they do is they pass information around the circuits in the brain. And dopamine is involved in many tasks in our body, especially movement. And what has been found in studies is that increased levels of dopamine have been shown to increase the severity of OCD. So as our levels of dopamine increase, so does our severity of OCD. We might start washing our hands more, having to flick on more light switches. So we've got two neurotransmitters that are heavily involved in most psychological topics you're going to learn about. Serotonin, our feel-good hormone, and dopamine. So remember, serotonin, low levels of serotonin increase our OCD, high levels of dopamine increase our OCD. The final part of the neural explanation is regarding how our brain functions. And this is where we get quite a few biological terms coming in. And if you can remember it, that's brilliant. If you can only remember the shorthand for the terms, then that's fine as well. So there's different parts of the brain involved, and we're going to go through these first just to highlight the key words you're going to have to be getting into any answer. We've got the orbitofrontal cortex, or the OFC. And this is responsible for causing anxiety. So in your brain, anytime you're anxious, the part of the brain that's causing that is the orbital frontal cortex. The next part is the caudate nucleus. And the caudate nucleus is a little bit like a filter. So any anxiety messages that come through have to go through the caudate nucleus. And what the caudate nucleus does, it allows big anxiety worries to go through, and it stops little worries coming through your brain and acting on them. So let's say you put your hand on a hot stove. An anxiety message gets sent from the orbitofrontal cortex, it gets to the caudate nucleus. This is a big anxiety message because your hand is burning. So the caudate nucleus allows that message to go through. However, if it was something small like a little bit of dirt on the end of your pen, your brain might send an anxiety message, right? There's dirt on the end of the pen, it gets to your caudate nucleus, it's a minor worry, so you ignore that. And what happens when this message gets through is it goes to something called the thalamus. And the thalamus is another part of your brain. And this is responsible for all the safety behaviours that you do. It might be cleaning, it might be washing, it might be doing a certain action to move something out of your way. So if we use the hot stove example, as soon as the caudate nucleus allows that through, the thalamus is the thing that helps you act, helps you move your hand away from that hot stove. So these are the three parts of the brain that are involved: the orbitofrontal cortex, the caudate nucleus, and the thalamus. So if we consider a healthy, normal person, so someone who doesn't have OCD, so what will happen is OFC sends a message, okay, to the thalamus. It sends a message about germs. Straight away the message is sent. The caudate nucleus stops all those little messages. There might be a bit of dirt on your hand. So the caudate nucleus will be like, right, that's a very small worry. We're not going to allow that through. And therefore, the thalamus doesn't act on that. The thalamus will only act on major worries. And that's why most people don't have OCD, because that caudate nucleus stops any messages coming through that are too small. We're only going to act on the very big anxiety messages that we need to. However, if we look in OCD patients, it's a completely different way of processing information. There's a part of the brain that's damaged. So your OFC sends that anxiety message. Again, it might be a little bit of dirt on your hand. However, now the caudate nucleus in OCD patients is damaged. So it can't suppress all those tiny worries. So every single message passes through this filter, through the caudate nucleus. And what happens is the thalamus has to act on all of these messages now. So every little bit of dirt, the thalamus is now having to act, having to wash your hands as a result of it. And this starts to cause a worry circuit in your brain, because the OFC will keep sending messages. They go through the caudate nucleus, goes through to the thalamus, you act on it. And this continues over and over and over and over again. And this is one of the potential reasons why people might have OCD. It's a damaged caudate nucleus. And as more evidence for this, there's been a lot of PET scans. So PET scans are where they show activity in the brain. And PET scans have shown increased levels of activity in the thalamus of OCD patients. So if you look here in a normal person, there's not too much activity going on in the thalamus here. However, with OCD patients, you can see an awful lot more activity is occurring in that particular part of the brain where the worry circuit exists. So this suggests that there must be a biological link for OCD, that normal people clearly don't have much activity going on there, whereas OCD patients have an awful lot more activity where we'd expect that worry circuit to be in the brain. So this diagram here is just to show you where a few parts of the processes that we've just been talking about exist. You can see here you've got the thalamus existing here. This is, remember, the part responsible for bringing about those behaviours. We've also got the caudate nucleus down here. So you've got two parts of the caudate nucleus. This part that acts as a filter for all the information that's coming through. And you can see here in this little box that it talks about the increased activity of the orbitofrontal cortex. So in OCD patients, we're expecting increased levels of anxiety being sent. We're expecting the caudate nucleus to be damaged, and we're expecting our thalamus to be hyperactive, to keep acting on the behaviours and all those anxiety messages that are coming through. So let's have a quick recap on the biological explanation then for OCD. We've already had a look at family studies. If we look at Lewis's study, it shows that there must be some genetic link there. It might be genetic vulnerability rather than certainty. We've got the COMT gene that regulates our dopamine levels, and that if there's a variation in OCD patients, it's likely that might be a cause for OCD. We've got serotonin, our feel-good hormone, and that if this is low, then our anxiety and OCD levels are likely to be higher. Increased levels of dopamine have also been shown to cause increased severity of OCD symptoms. And finally, the brain functioning. Our orbitofrontal cortex, our caudate nucleus and thalamus. So three main parts of the brain. And maybe these together might be the explanation for why people have OCD.